Hello, 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 and welcome to this edition of the Jolly Heretic on Tour. I have such a special guest for you today, and that is the comedian and writer, Mr. Dominic Frisby. Dominic, hello, how are you doing?
I'm very well, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm delighted to meet you.
I'm delighted to meet you too. I've been aware of your work for quite a while, and I also was very excited. I remember mentioning it to you last night about the shirt.
Well, you asked me to wear it.
I did. I thought it would be an appropriate balance with my plain shirt to have something that was floral and psychedelic.
Apparently, I look like a recently divorced art teacher that's just come from a divorce hearing. That's what.
Who on earth said that to you?
Leo Kearse.
Leo Kearse said that to you. A recently divorced art teacher. Oh, well, possibly. Speaking of art teachers, my parents are both art teachers.
Are they?
Or retired now. And back in the early 80s, they were able to get themselves a nice little house in Wimbledon on one art teacher's salary, you know, and pay off the mortgage and all this over a period of time. And it really wasn't a problem. And you've written a lot about economic issues and so forth. In fact, you did your Edinburgh stand-up lecture, didn't you? I
did one about tax.
Tax,
yeah.
And yeah.
I do what's called a lecture with funny bits every year. So I did one on tax, one on gold, one on weights and measures, which is a very interesting subject, and one on the history of the Fringe and how the economics of the Edinburgh Fringe relate to the philosophies of Adam Smith.
Exactly. So you don't just laugh, but you learn something. Exactly. You learn something, and not in a pretentious Stuart Lee kind of way, but you actually learn something. But that's an interesting question I was going to ask you. So I'm a lot of these bright young things in London. I bet last night, you know, they're 10 years younger than me or whatever, or 15 years younger than me, and they seem to have tremendous difficulty. Like the basic thing you need is if you want to have kids or whatever, is a bit of property, a house, and that was fine in the 80s. And even why has it become so hard for young people to get houses?
Well, it's one of the crimes of our age, and you know, your parents' existence in the 80s, it was possible on one salary to enjoy a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. It now takes two salaries and a shed load more debt. And there's two causes to high house prices. One is a lack of supply. Very little new stuff can be built because of prohibitive planning laws. But a bigger impact on house prices is our system of money. Fiat money, government currency. And what has happened is if you go back to 1970 and you look at average wages since 1970, they have gone up 22 times. If you look at house prices, average house prices since 1970, they have gone up 72 times. So they've gone up, 69 times. They've gone up by 3.5 times as much as wages. And so you've got wages going up like this and house prices going up like this. Now, if you look at the 19th century, and you look at, and everything's gone up in price since the 1970s. Doesn't matter if it's milk or car prices, or the only thing that's come down in price is phone calls, tech.
Yeah.
And, you know, it used to cost you 10p for 3 minutes to make a local call in the 1980s even. And now you can make a video call anywhere in the world and it costs you nothing.
I remember my mother saying, if you're going to ring your friend up to arrange a meeting on Saturday, wait till 6 o'clock. Wait till it's off-peak.
Yeah, that was the thing, off-peak phone calls. So, and if you look at consumer prices in the 19th century, when gold was money, we were on a gold standard. Over the course of the 19th century, they more than halved. Prices came down. So that meant the money that workers were paid in bought you more. And with the Industrial Revolution, we saw the rise of the middle class, and they were being paid in money that kept its value. And that created it created a society built on gold, on sound money. Whereas now, money is just a promise. And it's actually technically a promise of nothing. Because if you look at a £20 note, it says, I promise it to pay the bearer the sum of £20. And it once was £20 of sterling silver, but now it's just £20 of nothing. So money technically is a promise of nothing. So it's not real.
It's based on what, faith in the system, essentially.
Yeah. And in order for the system to function, it requires ever increasing money supply. So there's more money in the world than there's ever been before, and every year the money supply grows. And if you look at where money goes, most newly created money goes either into financial assets or it goes into the housing market. Because money is created when you issue mortgages. And so prior to the 70s and 80s, mortgages were much smaller. Prior to the 40s, mortgages barely existed at all. Do you know what mortgage means, by the way?
Or etymologically?
Yeah.
No.
Death grip.
Oh, of course, mort.
Yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, so the invention of the mortgage allowed for the creation of a lot more money. And that newly created money all went into the housing market, which was limited in how much it can expand. Then we've got the added pressure of immigration, which is a development over the last 20 years, which has put more downward pressure on wages. It's created competition for labour, so it's driven down wages, but it's created more demand for housing, so it's pushed up house prices. So all these things together are why houses are so unaffordable. And it is a terrible, terrible crime. Because if you look at why most people have smaller families and why they have families later in life, the most commonly given reason is, I can't afford to have more kids. And if you look at who has large numbers of kids, it's either the underclass or the richest people in the world, the Elon Musks of the world. Everyone in the middle has fewer kids. And the primary reason given is cost. And the most expensive cost is the cost of a house. If young people could afford houses, they would start families much earlier in life, and they would have bigger families as a result and healthier families. The decline of family size is caused by high house prices, which is a consequence of the system of money.
But is it the system of money? It's just inflation for the sake of it. I mean, what is it that causes the? I don't quite understand what causes the prices of houses to just go up and up and up and up and up.
Because you're putting more and more money in. It doesn't matter whether the money takes the form of cash or debt. Most money is debt. But either way, like if I loan you, if I'm a bank and if you come to me for a mortgage, you say I want a mortgage of £1 million to buy this house, that money that I lend you, I am loaning into existence. That £1 million did not previously exist. So the bank it's not built on what reserves the bank has. It is literally created into existence. You sort of winced and frowned when I said that.
Yeah.
That is how it works. And when that money, just £1 million that did not previously exist.
How can they do that?
It's the system. It's just what it is. Fiat money. And that £1 million that did not previously exist is now in the housing market. So there's £1 million more in the housing market. So house prices get £1 million more expensive.
And wages don't?
No. Because wages are paid largely out of cash flow. You don't borrow to pay wages. So you don't create new money. Whereas houses are created out of the money that buys them is created from debt. So new money goes into the housing market in a way that it doesn't go into the wage market.
But that's going to inherit. If there's more money, that's going to inherently devalue the money that already exists.
Yeah. Well, look at your money. Sterling has lost a third of its purchasing power, a third just since 2020.
Yes.
It is the crime of our age. Why?
I mean, it's essentially a tax. I mean,
yeah.
It's essentially a massive tax.
It's taxation without legislation. Milton Friedman called it.
So you're just devaluing the coinage. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's
theft.
Theft.
Yeah.
So what would happen economically if we said no, we're not having this anymore? Money will be based around gold. There is an amount of gold that the British we have. That's what. Ultimately, if you have a £20 note, you have the right, because gold has held its value over the years. Mm-hmm. That's the brilliance of it, and it's useful. And so you have the absolute right to go to the Bank of England and say, I want that in gold. Mm-hmm. What would happen to the economy? Then?
Well, you would have to if the gold, because Gordon Brown sold 2/3 of the nation's gold in 1999 at the bottom of the market. Did you know that?
Yes.
And so we're like the 19th largest gold owner in the world. We used to be like second or third. Like we're below like Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan and all these places.
Do they have fiat currency? Does anywhere?
They do, but they've got more. They've also got more gold than us. Everywhere, the whole world has fiat currency, but it's more evolved in the first world. There's more debt in the market in the first world. Japan, America, Europe.
Because I had a friend that lived in India for a while, and he said that in India you don't get a mortgage on a house, you buy a house outright.
So it's a cash-based market. So prices will bear a lot more relevance to earnings, and house prices will be a lot closer in cash-based markets. Because people, if they can't borrow the money into the existence, house prices are limited by the amount of cash that people have.
Right. So then the only way to end this ridiculous system would be to say that you cannot have mortgages on houses; they have to be outright. And if that happened, then you'd have all of these boomers or whatever that are sitting on these houses that have appreciated value, a lot of value, since they purchased them. For example, my grandfather bought his council house in 1988 or something for about £6,000.
Yeah.
And then it was sold for over 200,000 20 years later. So it's an incredible asset. And if you did that, then
if you took debt out of the market, house prices would collapse. But no government will let that happen, because even the collapse now between 89 and 94, when the Tories were in power, made the Tories effectively unelectable for 10, 12 years. It had a bigger negative effect on that Tory government than any other thing that they did was the house price crash.
Well, it was because you had all these people that were in negative equity.
Yeah, and they were putting people lost their houses. I'm not going to vote for a government that made me lose my house. And if you look at every single thing this government has done to make housing more affordable, every single policy has been based around some way of enabling there to get more debt into the market. And that will only push prices up, particularly while building is limited because of planning laws.
Yeah, if you can get people. Also, that was the other thing, I guess, in the 70s, a lot of people rented their homes, so there was less competition to buy a home.
Yeah. Rental prices bear a lot more relation to earnings. So like I bought a flat, my first flat, which I bought in 1993. At the time that I bought it, it was like the yield on the flat, in other words, what I could rent it out for, was more than 15%. Whereas now, that same flat, the yield would be like 3%. So what you can rent it out for, rent has gone up by nothing like as much as the actual price of the house, because the yields have come down.
Right. So the rent is a better marker of what's going on.
It's a better marker of what actual earnings are.
Yeah, which is that they're not doing well.
Yeah. But to answer your question, we should, on point of principle, go back to some kind of money system whereby it's the amount of money that can be created is limited by an asset like gold or silver or something. But if you did that, like the price of gold, because of the amount of money there is and the amount of gold there is, would have to be revalued upwards by many, many times, many hundreds of percent.
And presumably, if you did it, it would be such a shock to the system that it would collapse the economy, wouldn't it? I mean, there'd be chaos.
It would send us into a deflationary. So many people would lose so much money.
Of their worthless money.
Of their worthless money.
And so the only way that the problem can be solved is just a crash, an uncontrollable crash.
Which won't happen.
I
mean, you'll get little ones like 2008. But every time, 2008 was essentially a massive credit contraction. And the way they dealt with it was just by printing shed loads of money, quantitative easing. And then they slashed rates to zero and to encourage people to borrow more. So the way they dealt with the problem was to engineer ways by which money could be created.
But isn't that just sort of pushing the problem into the long grass? Pushing
Yes.
it into, I mean, doesn't it eventually, surely, if it is only based around essentially confidence in the American government
And the law.
And so if a society, as I think from my own research, this may well happen, loses confidence in those things, as you see a sort of South Africanization of society, you lose confidence in the government and you end up with de facto governments in South Africa of security firms, and you mark them on your houses, you're this security firm, but basically protection rackets, and you have no confidence in the police, you have security firm, you have no confidence in the law, then eventually that something must give.
I'm interested that you said the South Africanization of everything, because that's a phrase I've used on my Substack and I've written about it at great length. And I know the producer of this show is a friend of both of ours, and I think it was Alex that actually coined that expression. But I see Western Europe going exactly the same way as South Africa to the South Africanization of everything, little ghettoized societies, siloed societies. And you look at the Rand has been terrible. It's been much, much worse than the pound or the dollar. In the 70s, when the rand was effectively backed by gold because of all the gold that South Africa produced, it wasn't backed by it, but it was in effect backed by it, or to an extent. The rand has been a disaster. And Western currencies will go the same way as we head towards this South Africanization of everything. The second big thing you have to consider is China. If you like the global macro picture, China has been accumulating extraordinary amounts of gold. They're the world's largest producer, they're the world's largest importer, and it's been understating its gold reserves. And all the countries along the Silk Road, China's allies, not America's allies, have also been accumulating extraordinary amounts of gold, which is why the likes of Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan have more gold than we do. And they are looking to de-dollarize. They're looking to have a system of money by which they can all trade with each other that doesn't involve the US dollar in the banking system. Because by using the US dollar, you hand power to America. When, I say when, it might be if, but when the great showdown comes between China and America, Russia-China alliance and America, as we seem to be heading towards that, one of the things they will attack is the US dollar. And when that comes under attack, because China has extraordinary amounts, we're not at that point yet, but when it does, that is when they will undermine. And in the same way that, Russia has been deliberately sowing the seeds of division in the West for many years, sowing seeds of discontent and so on, when it decides to attack the money system, then we're in big trouble. Western Europe and anywhere with fiat currency is in big trouble. But if they attack the dollar, we're in big trouble.
And what would you augur would happen if they stopped using the dollar? And
very high inflation, much higher than the inflation we saw during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why to my readers, I always just say, own some gold, own some Bitcoin. And that's your little insurance, your hedge.
Yeah, because it's just confidence in that system. Mm-hmm. And as a person that researches intelligence, and as you find that intelligence is declining, which has big impacts on the smart fraction. Mm-hmm. If you lose 3 IQ points, which we would lose in about 30 years, that halves the percent of the society that has an IQ above 130.
Can you say that to me one more time?
As I understand it, if we lose 3 IQ points, that cuts in half the percentage of society that has an IQ above 130. And
why would we lose 3 IQ points?
Well, we're dysgenic to intelligence, so we're losing 1 IQ point per decade.
Really?
Yes. And
is that because we're not using our brains as much?
No, because we're not. Because intelligence is negatively associated with having children, and intelligence is highly genetic.
So one of the consequences of fewer children is lower IQs?
It's lower IQ because it's...
So you could say one of the consequences of high house prices is lower IQs then?
This is probably correct, yes. Yeah. Did you not know this?
I didn't know about the declining IQs. I'd heard Alex mention it, but I didn't realise...
Yeah.
But what about cumulative intelligence?
Cumulative intelligence? Mm-hmm. Oh, I see what you mean.
Standing on the shoulder. I'm only able to do the things I did
Indeed, yeah. We did... there were some studies on this, and it was found that the decline in intelligence is such that it's... So if we say, intelligence is declining, but the population is growing, so there are more people that have an IQ of 130, even though there's even though the IQ is going down. Mm-hmm. It's going down at such a rate that those two things don't balance out. So that's not solving it. And it's when you say cumulative intelligence, I suppose you mean
cumulative wisdom,
to learn, to learn things from the past, and that's.
I mean, like the computer power.
Yeah, right. So that's that's true.
Standing on the shoulders of giants.
It's in terms of civilizational decline. That's true that obviously slows it down. But what seems to be happening is that the intelligence goes down and down and down, and the number of people required to make an innovation, a serious innovation in technology, has doubled since 1979. So this is another evidence that we're becoming less intelligent. You see, there's more people required to get together to do the same kind of thing, to accumulate more.
Okay, and what about immigrant intelligence?
Immigrant intelligence,
because immigrants tend to have more get up and go and so on, don't they? Because of their
there is a selection. There is a weak correlation between immigrating and IQ, but the average IQ of the immigrant in Western countries is 10 points below that of the native. So that's reducing IQ. So even if there was no immigration, IQ would be going down, and we know this is genetic.
So immigration is accelerating.
It's accelerating the decline. Yeah. And the prevalence of alleles associated with high educational attainment, basically high intelligence, has declined over the last 4 generations. So, with regard to a question about cumulative knowledge, what basically happens is that you, as you become less intelligent, you are less able to efficiently and correctly use complex systems, and eventually then people lose confidence in those systems and society starts to regress. And also you can think of what we've done as a little bit like building up capital. So the highly intelligent innovator of the Industrial Revolution, he builds up the capital. He's got the invention, and you just need minor tinkering to keep it building.
Yeah, managers, rather.
Right, and then so IQ can go down. It doesn't matter because you just the minor tinkering. But eventually IQ goes down so far that you're not clever enough to minor tinker, and then you're not clever enough to actually keep the capital accrued, and you start eating into the capital.
Yeah.
You can't.
Absolutely.
This is
So there's no growth. That would explain the rot of the institutions.
Yes, I think partly. I mean, also there's other things. There's political obsession with equality and
but I mean, you're bringing in your diversity hires lower the IQ.
Exactly. So if you have, they lower the IQ and they lower the functioning. So it's been found that the correlation between the IQ of a society and its socioeconomic ability, as it were, is about 0.57. But the correlation between the functioning of the society and its smart fractions IQ was 0.66. It's higher. So it's more important that you have an intelligent smart fraction, and that smart fraction is rapidly falling, you see.
I've got 2 stories I want to tell you. The first story, to do with the decline of institutions and IQ levels and all the rest of it, concerns my younger daughter, who is a genius, like super bright, A stars in every GCSE, A stars in all her A levels. And she went to a nice public school in the West Country and Wells Cathedral College. And normally that school would expect to get 10 to 12 people into Oxford and Cambridge each year. That's the normal number. And in the year that she went, because of the new thing of not going to public schools to get their students, because of, affirmative action and all the rest, getting all the guys from state schools, from her year, 1 student. So from 10 to 12 to 1. So it's a 90% drop. Fortunately, that one person was my daughter. But so the intake of students at Oxford and Cambridge, now it might be that the kids from the state schools are brighter.
I doubt it.
And so this generation of students at Oxford and Cambridge will not be the geniuses.
And it's very interesting in terms of basic economics because I've done
and every public school was the same.
I've done a book on. I would look at this in some detail. There's basically a priestly cycle to universities. So it starts off, they're established by geniuses that come up with amazing stuff. This attracts like mid-wit intelligent people that are concerned with social conformity and all this sort of thing. They then chuck out the geniuses. They make it an institution about ideology and promotion of ideology. Then the institution starts to be abandoned, it no longer has prestige, and then they have to reform or die. And this has happened before. So it used to be
Oxford and Cambridge.
Oxford and Cambridge, absolutely. So it used to be Oxford and Cambridge, established by geniuses, whatever. Then they become arms of the Church of England, effectively, and they're finishing schools for the upper classes. So you go back to the 19th.
So when was this?
Well, certainly by the 1700s, 1600s.
They'd become
and then they start to go into decline, and fewer and fewer.
So when Adam Smith went, Adam Smith went to, I think he went to Oxford.
No, he didn't. He went to Edinburgh, I would think.
No, he didn't. He went to I think it was Oxford. It might have been Glasgow, and he left, and he went and instead he went to Glasgow.
Right, this is it.
As a lecturer.
There's many examples.
And at that time, Glasgow was ahead.
Was more prestigious. Yeah, I didn't know he went to Oxford. But
can I tell you the reason?
Yes.
Are you interested in the reason?
Well, yes.
Because so in those days, the lecturers would be paid. He went there as a teacher, I should say, but their earnings were based on the amount of students they got on their course. So it was a performance-related pay, if you like, and the number that graduated from their course. Whereas Oxford and Cambridge was all funded by endowments and all the rest of it. So there wasn't the same incentive. And so Adam Smith actually wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments as a loss leader in order to make a name, a bit like you make the YouTube video in order to get people to subscribe to your Substack or something like that. He did that in order to make a name for himself and get people to come to Glasgow.
That's very interesting.
And his pay was determined by performance.
That's very interesting. I didn't know. That's very interesting. But it certainly is true that at that time, Oxford and Cambridge became basically finishing schools for the upper class that weren't very intellectual. A bit like, I don't know, going to Eton these days and then going to agricultural college. Something like that, right? A finishing school. Whereas the places, the ancient Scottish universities, that was where the clever kids went, and also abroad. So you'll see in the history of our prime ministers from the 18th century, a lot of them, they go to Oxford or Cambridge, and then they go to Leiden or Groningen or somewhere in Germany. And because that was because all the higher education students were in Latin, of course, and so because that was where the clever people went.
Okay.
You know, Darwin was too lazy to keep going at Edinburgh University, so he had to go to Cambridge.
I'll tell you another story related to this, but we were talking about diversity hires and how they lead to lowering of standards. So I play tennis with Chinese Elvis, right? He's an Elvis impersonator who is Chinese, and he earns his living doing Elvis impersonations as a Chinese guy. But he's from Yorkshire, and he freely admits himself he doesn't do a particularly good Chinese accent. And he doesn't even do his Chinese accent when he does his Elvis act. And he's also with the same voiceover agent as me. And they were recently doing a commercial where they needed someone to do a Bruce Lee impersonation in this commercial. You don't see the person who's doing it, you just hear the voice. And this other friend of mine, who is white, but grew up in Hong Kong, spent the first 25 years of his life in Hong Kong, is a brilliant mimic. And he's also, because he grew up in Hong Kong, he's brilliant at doing Chinese accents. And he can do all the different Chinese accents from the different bits of China and all the subtle nuances. And he just does the best Chinese accents. But they wouldn't give him the job doing the Bruce Lee impersonation because he was white, even though he grew up in Hong Kong.
And even though it's a voiceover.
And it's a voiceover. And so they insisted on having a Chinese guy do it. So they got my friend, this other friend of mine, Chinese Elvis, to do it, who's just like laughing because he's got a voiceover out of it. And he just goes, I do a crap Bruce Lee impersonation. It's just really, really generic. So the result of that diversity hire and is that the product that's now on the television or wherever it is doing this Bruce Lee impersonation is nowhere near as good as it could have been if they'd gone for the best person for the job. And so that is how it leads to second-rate performance.
Exactly, precisely. And so what would eventually happen, what we would predict happen, and it happened before. You had this before, that the clever kids go to Scotland, or there were the dissenting academies, of course. There were loads of those. Warrington, for example, and some of them were so good. Oxygen was discovered at one of the dissenting academies, for example, by a professor there. That Anglicans would send their clever kids there rather than to Oxford or Cambridge, or as well as. So I didn't know that. You told me that anecdote last night, and I didn't know it was voiceover. Yeah. I thought it was, because you can't have a white person playing Bruce Lee as well. That's even worse.
So stupid.
Absolutely preposterous.
Yeah.
So
I'm interested about education because with the other problem that education has is the cost of tertiary education. It's so expensive. And the value of the degree is questionable in the marketplace. And then you've got all these free online universities. And at a certain, to me, like a degree from the Khan Academy or something, doesn't carry the same prestige as a degree from Oxford or Durham. But in a funny kind of way, it should carry more because the guy who does the Khan Academy one that is free is more motivated. He's had to do it himself rather than just go through the system. And so, and he might be some poor kid from the Sahara or India or something who's just done it off his own back with his own get up and go. They don't carry the same prestige at the moment, but eventually...
Well, a big part of the prestige...
I mean, the internet is the most fantastic learning tool ever invented, and it's free.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, a big part of the prestige of the degree is that it's associated with the upper class. That's a big part of it. And that's why you mentioned Oxford and Durham. Well, Durham didn't used to be prestigious. Durham became prestigious from about 1950 onwards, when Oxford and Cambridge were put under pressure not to just go around the public schools and he's a good chap, let him in, and to actually have a proper interview process and make it more difficult to get in. So then you've got all these public school boys whose parents had been to Oxford and Cambridge and they were rejected. So they wanted something like Oxford and Cambridge. What did you have? Durham. Now, until then, Durham was the university you went to if you were from the northeast of England. And in those days, of course, you had to have an O-level Latin and things like this to go to Oxford or Cambridge. So that basically just discriminated against anyone from state school and even some private schools. So they would go to their local university, to Durham, and no, but then these posh people start coming to Durham, and now Durham is associated with the upper class, and so it's prestigious. And St Andrews, similar thing has happened with St Andrews, and to a lesser extent the other Scottish universities. So what these leftists don't seem to understand, it's almost as if they see prestige, they reify it. They see it as it's in stone. Oxford and Cambridge are prestigious. Therefore, it is unfair that they are, I don't know, 50% private school or whatever. And even though intelligence, even though socioeconomic sense of origin correlates with intelligence, but never mind. And so let's push in all these people from state schools. But the result is the prestige just goes where you're pushing these people to.
Okay, I hear you, but I still say this. If I was given the choice, if I was going to university or my kids were going to university and they had a choice of Oxford and Cambridge or somewhere else, I would still say go to Oxford.
Now, yeah.
Because I'm an old-fashioned snob, and I like being able to say my kids at Oxford or Cambridge, but B, because of the network of people.
Yeah, now, yeah, still now, yeah. But that can gradually change. And eventually the network of people, and you're right, that's highly important, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham as well, London, these kinds of places, but the network is the upper classes and their connections. If that goes, then there's much less of a point to it. Before I continue with the red pills, I must quickly remind you of a white pill. Whatever disasters we are going to witness, the world will keep spinning because the conservative and the religious are having more children than the progressives, meaning that eventually all spiteful mutants will be bred out of the gene pool and society will function once again like it used to. You've obviously heard this argument before from me, and I've developed it in my book, The Past is Future Country, The Coming Conservative Revolution, with my co-author, Joe A. Rayner Hills. You should definitely read that book, but if you haven't got the time to read it, I can offer you a shortcut. There is, in fact, a very good summary of our core arguments available, which you can listen to in just under 20 minutes on Leargent.com. Leargent is a new app where you can read and listen to short summaries of all the key arguments of many based books. These are all under 25 minutes long, so you can finish the whole book while you're out and about, in the gym, or on your way to work. Now, you might have heard of some competitors with a similar offer, but the big difference is that you will never find my books or books as the bell curve on these platforms. Leargent, on the other hand, is a platform run by based people who specifically want you to know about my research and those of others like me. So go on to Leargent.com now and sign up with my promo code TJH for a 10% discount. I wanted to move on, though, because I was very interested in your... in the economic stuff, as I said to you earlier, and I was particularly interested in what you were saying about tax and inflation. And you have a sort of model of history, as I understand it, where every central change in revolution, whatever, can ultimately in some way be traced back to tax. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I can. So I wrote a book called Daylight Robbery, which is an expression that derives from the window tax, by the way. And it was basically a history of taxation. And this came from an Edinburgh show that I'd done about taxation. And taxation is as old as civilization. There has never been a society without some kind of taxation. And in fact, there was probably this idea of a sense of duty to the greater collective that will have existed in the hunter-gatherer societies that predated civilization. So taxation has always been there, hence the expression, death and taxes, the two things that are inevitable. And what has changed, though, throughout society is the level to which we are taxed. And once you realise that taxation has always been there, you actually design a society the way you tax it. You design the incentives, you design how free the people are, you put the destiny of that country, you determine the destiny of that country because free and innovative countries are always low-tax countries. You determine how prosperous the people will be, how subordinated, how inventive, and so on, by the taxes that you impose on that country. And then when you look at, you could pretty much take any great event in history and just tell me a great event in history.
The Russian Revolution.
The Russian Revolution, okay. There is almost always an untold tax story at the heart of it, without which that event would have turned out very differently. And in the case of the Russian Revolution, and just about every other revolution in history, it has always been a rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. Some economic inequality. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, American Revolution, no taxation without representation. Every revolution, every conquest has been about taking control of the tax base, the land, the labour, the produce, the profit. Every war has been funded by some kind of tax, either during the event or after. You plunder and then you tax. War, debt, by the way, is just another form of taxation. It's a tax on the future. Inflation, as we've already seen, is taxation without legislation. And taxation is actually like a measure of freedom. And like if you took at one extreme, you have a slave society. The slave has no ownership of his own body. And totalitarian society, the worker in North Korea or somewhere has no ownership of his labour. And then you have an anarchy where there's no tax at all, which has never properly existed, where the worker owns all of his body and all of his labour. And the social democracies of the West are somewhere in the middle between the two. Over the course of our lives, roughly 50% of everything we ever earn will be taken from us in taxes. We said a house was the most expensive thing you ever buy. It isn't. It is, in fact, your government. Over the course of your life, the most expensive thing you ever buy is your government, which you pay for in taxes. And so tax has, once you start looking at the world through this prism of even things like the first men on the moon, NASA was a tax-funded operation. The birth of Christ, well, Mary and Joseph were both in Bethlehem to pay taxes for the census. Just every event.
Well, that's interesting because there's some evidence that that's not the case. That's not true. That's made up. There's no evidence outside of the Bible that this occurred, and it seemingly didn't occur, which makes one wonder.
What do you mean?
They didn't go to their home place, and this taxation thing under the emperor did not. It doesn't seem. The census does not seem to have happened.
Yeah, there's various arguments about that, but there was some kind of census that was taken. And by the way, the word census, where we get censorship from. The censor was the Roman magistrate who was responsible for maintaining the public morality, and he was also responsible for the collection of taxes.
I see. But that just made me wonder if that didn't happen like that, if they realised that your theory, they realised that every dramatic thing involves taxation, so let's write it into the story.
I'd love it. And also the death of Christ as well, the crime for which he was eventually crucified was effectively non-payment of taxes, forbidding to pay tribute to Caesar.
What about something like, I'm sure you'll, in any example I give you, you can reduce it down to it. But what would be a good one? I mean, so the Norman Conquest, where that's land grab. So that's
land grab and conquest, and then you got the Doomsday Book, which followed, and the realignment of everything. But every conquest is about taking control of the land, the labour, the produce, the profit.
The Peasants' Revolt, of course, is the most famous example.
The Peasants' Revolt. So there's quite an interesting story. It was only the aristocracy that had surnames until the 12th and 13th century. And why did ordinary people start getting surnames? And the reason was so that they could be identified for the purposes of collecting taxes, poll taxes. And so you would be Tom the Smith, or Tom who lives by the hill, Tom Hill, or Tom John's son, and you'd either have a name based on your heritage or your where you lived or your profession. And with the Black Death wiped out 2/3 of the European population, something like that, depending on which number you read. And for one of the first times in history, there was a shortage of labour. And so serfs, who were the descendants of Roman slaves, who previously lived on the land, and as if the land changed hands, then the serfs would change hand with the land. They were owned by their lord, and they had to give their lord half their working week, a bit like us workers today. We have to give the state half of our working week, and the other half of our produce we get to keep for ourselves. The serf had a similar existence. He could work his own land half the week and half the land he could work for he had to work for his lord. But with the Black Death, there was suddenly a shortage of labour relative to the amount of land there was. And serfs were suddenly able to go, you're going to have to charge me. Otherwise, I'm going to go and work on that farm because he's offered to pay me. And so serfs were liberated. And it was a liberating force. And as a result, serfs started handling money for the first time, coinage. Until then, serfs weren't allowed to handle specie. And there were all sorts of laws as they became more and more powerful to sort of keep them down. Like there was a thing called the Sumptuary Act, where underclasses were limited in the food they were allowed to eat and the clothes that they were allowed to wear and so on. But even so, they became an increasingly powerful group. And there wasn't just a peasants' revolt in Britain. There were peasants' revolts all across Europe. It was a common thing. But the peasants' revolt in England specifically was led by a chap called Walter Tyler. And he was a low person and a tiler of roofs. That was why he was Walter the Tiler, hence. And he was the man who led it. But it began because John of Gaunt, Richard II was a child king, so John of Gaunt was the effective king. And he was waging wars in Scotland, in Ireland, and on the continent. And he needed money to pay for them. And he kept imposing poll taxes. And the first poll tax, he raised a certain amount. And immediately the following year, he imposed another. That didn't raise as much. And then a third. And that didn't raise as much. And then he got really cross. So he sent in the tax collectors to collect the money. And the peasants refused. They beheaded the tax collectors and refused to pay. And that's gradually how the revolt came about.
And also, as I understand it, the tax collectors were checking things in the most appalling ways. So if you were a woman, they wanted to know if you had gone through puberty yet, and then you could be taxed. They'd literally look at whether they had vaginal hair.
That was why Walter Tyler is supposed to have beheaded the tax collector, because he was looking at his daughter's vagina.
Yep.
Bit like you last night with... Sorry, I was only kidding.
Well, yeah, you got to check these things out for anthropological purposes. But no, it's entirely true. And I suppose also with a lot of people don't realise that the Civil War, in the English Civil War, part of what that was about was effectively it was distraint of knighthood, and distraint of knighthood was effectively a tax. You know, so
it was also about who had the power to collect taxes, Parliament or the Crown. And the Crown started imposing ship tax because it had no other ways. And then one of the parliamentarians, I forget his name, refused to pay the shipping tax. And it was a rule of who collected taxes.
Yes, and so again we're getting back to what you're saying about fiat currency. I mean they take our money in whatever roughly 50%, and they're a protection racket. I mean that's what a government is. It's a protection racket, effectively. And then increasingly, of course, in this country, there's almost an anarcho-tyranny. They don't protect you. The police don't come and investigate burglaries. They'll investigate if you put a mean tweet about transsexuals or something, but they won't investigate the basic laws that you're paying them. You are paying them compulsorily, as you had compulsorily to pay the Krays, to look after you, and they are derelict in that duty.
Absolutely. This is one of the great issues that so many people have. They're not getting value for money. The NHS isn't doing what it's supposed to do. The schools aren't doing what it's supposed to do. There are too many potholes on the roads. You know, it's pretty hard to find a government body that is working well at the moment. And this is one of the issues. Like if you go into a shop and, you know, you get shit service in the shop, you don't have to go into that shop again. You go into another shop. But with government services, that is the only shop. There's no accountability. You don't have the power of the customer with government, whereas you have it in a free market.
So you have the power, supposedly, to change the government, although obviously we know that's highly limited and meaningless. So I suppose you have the power to emigrate. That's one of the things that you do get when countries are particularly rubbish, like Zimbabwe or something, or South Africa. People just leave. They up and find another protection racket to be part of.
Mm-hmm. You're seeing one of the fastest growing workforces in the world is the digital nomad. Sovereign individuals who pay tax to no man because they travel from place to place, and they're called stateless individuals. And in a funny kind of way, it's actually a pain in the arse to be a digital nomad because you have to keep moving. But at the same time, yeah, you've given the two fingers to the man because nobody owns you.
Nobody owns you. You're no longer a serf. I mean, what we were talking about intelligence earlier, I think also that's germane to the Peasants' Revolt, because it was about, as I understand it was about 40% or 50% of people that died in the Black Death, but it was 80% of the serfs and free labourers. 80%.
I didn't know that.
And
yeah.
now, and that is going to have and the intelligence is highly genetic, and it's hereditary, and it correlates with social class at around 0.5, 0.6. And so what you would have then would be a mass cull during the Black Death of basically low IQ people. So suddenly you've got a much more intelligent society, and the remnant surviving serfs are likely to be more intelligent. A, because intelligence genetically correlates with health, genetic health, and B, because you're more likely to make decisions to get out of the cities or whatever and be able to afford to do so and protect yourself. So you've now got an intelligent working class, and who are then able to organise, get together, and operate.
And their figurehead was this chap, John Bull. He was the ideological leader. And he went round the country preaching, and he kept being excommunicated. The Archbishop of Canterbury hated him, and but he was the sort of he gave the great speech, great speeches.
Yes, and he that's another example of the Lollards that they you have a gradually more intellectual culture. I mean, the time of Chaucer and all this, you've got this sort of intellectual awakening. Almost,
and he was preaching the Bible in English.
And that's in Canterbury Tales that he has the priest telling us about the Bible in English in the Priest's Tale, and the Wife of Bath.
I think what was the date? Canterbury Tales might have been almost at the same time. 1380.
It was the Black Death was 1340s.
No, the
Peasants' Revolt 1380.
1381. I think.
81, and the Chaucer's a bit later, I think.
Okay.
But 10 years later, something like that.
Okay.
And you think he died about 1400. And so you've got this. You'd expect this. The next generation will therefore be much more intelligent than the last generation. So you'd have a sort of intellectual flowering, which you see the beginnings of, the Proto-Reformation, questioning of things.
I want to write a musical about the Peasants' Revolt. I just think it's the most brilliant story. In fact, I've already started work on it. So wish me luck. And look out for it, dear viewer.
I think that would be an excellent idea.
I think it'd be brilliant.
A Peasants' Revolt with Lollardy stuff in it as well.
Yeah.
Are you ready for the future of the West?